Hey friends, it's Just the Gems. I'm Brandon. Any other English majors out there? Sure, my parents wanted me to be a doctor or a lawyer, but I just wanted to chill and read a book. The types of stories told in literature are pretty wide and varied, but there's a generally accepted canon of texts that English scholars sort of hold up as essential. Now, there are a lot of issues with that, of course, because for one, it's not exactly like there were a ton of different voices represented in that canon. For every Virginia Woolf, there are like 50 old dudes like me. That's a problem, but I'm not going to be able to solve that with a YouTube video. Instead, I thought it would be fun and not at all divisive to try and establish a JRPG canon of our own. The genre has been with us for around 40 years, which isn't very long in the grand scheme of media, but long enough that we've been graced with a ton of worthy titles. So I think it'll be fun and not at all ironic for this old man to tell you which games are essential. Okay, real quick side note for the people who are going to get mad at me. This is just for fun. I don't have the authority to establish a real canon, but at the very least, maybe it'll start a conversation down in the comments. I'd love to hear whether you agree or disagree with my picks, so let me know. Also, if you wouldn't mind liking the video to help it out in the algorithm, I'd really appreciate it. And if you're not subscribed, would you consider subscribing? My mom told me if I break 10,000 subscribers, she'll write me back into the will, so that would be fantastic. I'm just kidding, I was never in the will. Okay, on with the video. Okay, so in thinking about the canon of JRPGs, I'm really considering it a Western canon of JRPGs, if that makes sense. I know that's kind of a contradiction in terms. If we were to do one of these sort of videos encompassing all of the JRPGs that have ever been released in any region, it's gonna look a bit different than this, but this is what I'm gonna go with just to keep this from being 20 hours long. I've picked a handful of games from each generation-ish, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail here in a minute. And I'm hoping that I can just kind of talk through why I think they're important or why I believe they deserve to be included in a list like this, like the essential JRPGs that you should play if you want to have a full and complete education or understanding of the genre. Okay, so if we're talking about the classic Western English canon, literary canon, there are several different eras or time periods that these different works are sorted into. And by the way, this research that I did comes from Wikipedia. I didn't go any deeper than that. I didn't dig into it. I've been out of college now for like almost 20 years. I'm not doing that again. I'm just not doing it again. So Wikipedia is as much as I'm ever gonna do for something like this. Where really the time periods that I've chosen are just kind of a framing device. They're not actually that important, but anyway, it doesn't matter. So the time periods that we have in the English Western canon are the medieval period, the Renaissance, the Restoration period, the Romantic period, the Victorian period, and what I'm calling the modern period. They might call it 20th century and beyond or something like that, but I'm just gonna think of this as the modern period because all of these technically have taken place in the 20th century and beyond, so it wouldn't be very helpful, you know? Anyway, so going back to the medieval era of JRPGs, I want to talk about a handful of games that I think really formed the genre and kind of laid the groundwork for what it is today. The original Final Fantasy. And this was, so revolutionary for its time, right? Like, it wasn't the first JRPG, it wasn't the first console JRPG. Others had come before it. You can make an argument that wizardry was a big part of the foundation of JRPGs and maybe deserves to be included in this list as well, and a handful of others that were really formative. But Final Fantasy, the original Final Fantasy, really established the rhythm of the genre as it would grow and evolve over the years, right? You have your party of heroes, you have a variety of quests that you undertake as you make your way through the world, through the story, right? There's a story here, and I mean, by modern standards, it's really primitive, but it was actually kind of crazy and wild at the time compared to just about every other video game, right? Like, not only do you have your epic quest to restore light to the orbs or crystals or whatever you want to call them, but you have quests that happen along the way, right? Like you need to save the princess. That's the first thing you do. A lot of games, that's the last thing you do, right? That's the final goal. But this was just the first kind of opening act. And then you have to, you know, wake up a sleeping prince and there's all these different things you have to do as you go about the story. And that really kind of became what the genre is. It complexified, that's not a word. This is why I usually script. I'm just making stuff up now. But it added this layer of complexity to the storytelling. Not only that, of course, it established sort of the party battle system. And I know, like, it didn't really establish that, right? Like, Dragon Quest had entries with multiple party members, I'm pretty sure, before Final Fantasy came out. I could fact check that. Maybe I will. I don't know if I will. But, you know, it went a long way towards normalizing that, right? It took what others had laid down and picked it up and ran with it. And it's really actually kind of hard to overstate how important Final Fantasy is, the original Final Fantasy, to the genre as a whole. You know, I know in Japan, especially, Dragon Quest is probably way more beloved than even Final Fantasy. Not that Final Fantasy is not beloved, but Dragon Quest has a very special place in their hearts. And I know it has a very special place in a lot of Americans' hearts too, mine included. I love Dragon Quest as well. But Final Fantasy was really kind of, for me at least, the baseline of like, this is a JRPG, right? This is what it's going to become, or this is where it's going to grow from going forward. So since I've already talked about Dragon Quest, let's go ahead and talk about Dragon Quest. As you can see, here I have a copy of Dragon Warrior on the Nintendo Entertainment System. Now, this came out, of course, prior to Final Fantasy, so it's technically speaking more primitive, right? Like, you don't have a party of heroes. You have one dude, one blue dude walking around fighting one enemy at a time. You're not even fighting mobs of enemies. You're fighting a single enemy per battle, and that's about all there is to it, right? This is, again, it's like, it's hard to overstate how important this was, though, to bringing the JRPG as we know it to consoles, to these machines that sort of made gaming way more accessible to more people. Like, you know, not everybody at the time had a personal computer. There were games like this on computers back then, right? And even before this, but not everybody had a computer. But Nintendo put out a little machine that plays these cartridges, and they made it reasonably affordable for most people. And so this brought this sort of genre into the living rooms of people around the world. So, you know, despite its simplicity, despite its pretty short length, really, like, it's a very small game when you compare it to, especially even just the Dragon Quest that came after it. It's a very small game, but it is so important in bringing awareness of the genre to America, right? Like, this was my first JRPG. This showed up in the mail one day because I subscribed to Nintendo Power, and I made too many of them and just had to give them away. I don't know what the story was exactly, but it was a promotional thing or something. But here I was with Dragon Warrior, and it just blew my mind that you could have a game like this. Like, you're not just restricted to this 2D plane. You can go anywhere, and walking through caves and forests and over mountains and going into cities, and it just was mind-blowing. So I don't think that there will be much disagreement with my inclusion of Dragon Warrior or Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy in the Western JRPG canon. I feel like probably y'all are on board with that, right? Let's get in some more, maybe touchy ones. Why don't we? I'm gonna say Xanadu has a place in the canon. I say that even not being the biggest fan of Xanadu. And if you're wondering why I'm pronouncing it Xanadu, in case you haven't heard the story, this was an adaptation, or in the series, the Xanadu series, produced, I think, by Falcom, actually. But this was the version made for Famicom, so it was Famicom Xanadu. Xanadu. I grew up saying Faxanadu, like I think a lot of kids did, but Xanadu apparently. So Xanadu showed us sort of what an action RPG could do on a 2D plane, right? So it's very simplistic compared to modern action RPGs and even modern, like, Metroidvania style games that have JRPG systems built into them. And we might or might not talk about some of those here. in the coming minutes. But it really kind of presented this fantasy world and this deep and complex series of interconnected environments, and gave you a ton to do, a town to explore, money, equipment, experience. Like, it really kind of tickled my imagination at the time when I first played it. And I think it holds up okay, like especially for its age and what it was doing. So as an action RPG on a 2D plane, I feel like this was pretty formative for that side of the genre. So that's why I'm including it here. Similarly, and like I sort of alluded to, I'm gonna put Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest in the canon. This looks like it's got some poo-poo on it or something. I don't know what this is. This is not my childhood copy. I did not get poo-poo on my games. I don't even want to know what it is. I should clean it, but I haven't gotten around to it. I don't even remember where I got it. It doesn't matter. Point is, I don't think it's actually poo-poo, but I don't like it. I don't want to look at it anymore. But Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest, as much as people talk about Metroidvanias and give equal sort of credit to Metroid for establishing the Metroidvania genre, and that is true. I'm not saying that's not true. Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest took it a step further by incorporating more of those JRPG elements into the gameplay. So you have basic leveling, you have equipment, you have, the ability to wander freely like in a typical Metroidvania, puzzles to solve, things of that nature that we associate more with the Castlevania branch of the Metroidvania subgenre or whatever. And the Castlevania branch of that genre is just much, much more heavily RPG focused. So that's why I think Simon's Quest belongs on this list, because without Simon's Quest, you don't have Symphony of the Night. And without Symphony of the Night, I don't know where we would be. We would be lacking. If we woke up tomorrow and we lived in a world where Castlevania Symphony of the Night didn't exist, sort of like the movie Yesterday. If you have seen the movie Yesterday, the guy woke up and he was suddenly in a world where the Beatles didn't exist and he was the only one who remembered them. I feel like that would be sad, because in that movie, he was a musician, was able to recreate the music of the Beatles. I'm not a game developer. I couldn't recreate Castlevania Symphony of the Night. So I'd be bummed. I wanted to talk a little bit about Crystallis as well. I have a feeling that if I was more familiar with Crystallis, that it would find a place in this canon for me, but I've never really played it. I think I played a few minutes of it as a kid at someone's house or something, and I've never played it as an adult. So I don't want to include it just because I don't want to be super disingenuous and be like, yes, everybody says this game is great, so it belongs in the canon. Maybe it does, and it probably does. If you've played it and you think it's worth checking out even as an adult, let me know. I will always check out games on recommendation from folks like you. Thank you in advance. The last game I wanted to mention, I don't have a physical copy of because it's so expensive, and I've only ever played it on the Switch in the kind of updated version that they put out, but Phantasy Star. Phantasy Star for the Sega Master System is, just crazy what they were able to do with an 8-bit game. Like the smooth scrolling in the dungeons, the first-person dungeons, just the colorful graphics, the sort of comic book anime, simplistic for the time, but better than most anything that was out, right? Little comic book cutscenes that they had throughout to tell the story. The fact that you're traveling between planets in this big sci-fi adventure, it really did lay groundwork for not just future Phantasy Star games, but like, I don't know that we have Star Ocean down the line without Phantasy Star having been a thing, right? So I think we, as appreciators of the genre, owe a lot to Phantasy Star for what it brought. Okay, so those are my picks for the medieval period, which I'm saying is like the 8-bit, the 8-bit era, the medieval period of JRPG canon. Moving into the Renaissance period. I have a handful of games here. They are, again, mostly from Super Nintendo. I was a Nintendo boy. I had both. I had a Sega Genesis and a Super Nintendo, but when it comes to JRPGs, there's never been much argument, right, that the Super Nintendo just had way more. Not that the Genesis didn't have any, or not that the Genesis didn't have some good ones, but the Super Nintendo had way more. So let's talk through the Super Nintendo selections I have here first. All right, first up, probably goes without saying, but Final Fantasy IV or 2, as I knew it as a young boy. This is the most logical sequel to the original Final Fantasy that I could imagine. The only sequel that's more logical to the original Final Fantasy is its actual sequel, Final Fantasy II, which we didn't get until quite a bit later. But to me, as a kid, having played a little bit of Final Fantasy as a kid and then getting Final Fantasy II, it's like, yes, this is the evolution of that style. But it brought something really, really key, really, really, really important to the genre that games hadn't quite figured out how to do yet, at least games that we received, right? It gave us a deep and complicated story with a huge assortment of characters that all had distinct personalities, kind of a revolving cast of characters as you go through the story. The makeup of your party changes. Every character has like a specialization, so you're not choosing your party members like you did in the original. When you put together your party of 4 at the beginning, you choose their class or whatever. Here, you just kind of, you get what you get based on where you're at in the story. And sometimes that puts you at a disadvantage and sometimes it puts you in an advantage. And that's just the way it is. And you just adapt. And having all of these characters and having this story made just a world of difference in showing us what a JRPG really could be. It's just incredible. And I'm just going to mention it here, even though I probably could go on for even longer about this game that I'm going to talk about now and Final Fantasy IV. But Final Fantasy VI, again, or 3 as it was known in the US, just like perfection of that formula, that particular branch of the tree of JRPG canon. It took everything that made the Final Fantasy series up to that point so compelling, and it just perfected it, right? You've still got your huge cast of characters with their unique abilities. You've still got this compelling story that takes place over this big span of time. And it's so difficult to really explain how important these two games are to the canon for us. Like, I had to capture some footage for Final Fantasy VI, the Pixel remaster, for another video or a collab I was doing, I think. And I ended up playing it for hours. Like, I just needed to get a little bit of footage just to put in my video. But like, I just couldn't stop. And I've played this game, I don't know, 15 times. It's so compellingly fantastic. And it's so important in pushing the bar even higher, right, for what storytelling in these games can be. I gotta stop because I could just go on and on about it, but it's just such an important game. It's such an important game. All right, let's talk about Earthbound real quick. Earthbound. Everybody knows Earthbound. It's a much sought after game these days. At the time, I don't think it was actually very well accepted. It was kind of thought of as kind of being weird. Maybe it was a little too simplistic looking. Like, it didn't super look like a Super Nintendo game, right? The graphics were pretty bare bones, simple. I mean, today they have all the charm that we're looking for, right? Like, this game released today would do crazy numbers. At the time, didn't do great. Not that they didn't print a lot. Like, this is one of those weird situations where a game is very valuable, costs a lot of money to buy, but is in no way rare. It is not a rare game in any sense of the word. It is a very common game. It's just very expensive. And look, Earthbound took the established JRPG formula, and it didn't do anything super crazy with the gameplay, right? Like, it plays like any other JRPG. You have your battle commands, your magic or psychic powers, as they call it in this series. And, you go around a world and you encounter characters, put together a party to battle an ultimate evil. It's checking all those boxes. But it was so radically different than anything else around it in the space because of its setting and the fact that it, even despite telling a serious story, never takes itself so seriously that it can't have a good time. It's hilarious and it's moving strangely sometimes, and it's just such a compelling world, and it's all in this sort of modern day quasi-American setting. It's a masterpiece of a game. It's astonishing to me that, I don't know, Shigesato Itoi is the creator. He's not really a video game maker. He made, I think, 3 video games. He made Mother 2, Earthbound, and Mother 3, and I think that was it. I think he was like, I'm done. I'm good. I did what I want to do in video games. I'm off to write other things, I'm assuming. I don't know. He's a writer. It's surprising to me that Nintendo didn't push him more to have him make some more games for them, because, like, I would love to see a modern Shigesato Itoi game where he's at now in life compared to when he made Earthbound and Mother 3. Just very important and just a very, very good game. I want to talk about Secret of Mana. Secret of Mana here. There's a lot of really good action RPGs on the Super Nintendo. You've got your Illusions of Gaia, your Soul Blazers, your Terranigmas. Anyway, yeah, just like some really fantastic action RPGs. Secret of Mana was just this seminal experience of a game, right? It was Squaresoft kind of at the peak of their power during the 16-bit era, firing on all cylinders, putting together just a brilliant game. It is colorful. It feels magical to play. It's not a perfect game, of course. None of these are perfect games, and they don't need to be included in this list, obviously. But just so much about this elevated the entire action RPG subgenre, and it deserves its place on this list for all of that it did. And even more, like I haven't even talked about the music. Hiroki Kikuta just wrote one of the most amazing soundtracks, period. Like not even just on the Super Nintendo or in the 16-bit era, just period. And he's a genius. And the team behind this game deserves all the accolades they get for this work. You know, Seiken Densetsu 3, which we only just recently got in the past 8 or 9 years or so over here as Trials of Mana, is, I think a lot of people would say, even better. And I don't know if I would disagree with that. I haven't played it in full. I can see how they took this, you know, what they did in Secret of Mana and just kind of elevated it to the next level. But for now, for me, Secret of Mana takes its place on this list. Shining Force 2. I was originally only going to talk about one Genesis game out of this whole Renaissance period of JRPGs. I've kind of decided to call an audible, and I'm going to talk about 3. One of them might be obvious. The other 2, actually, they're probably all obvious. And I'll just go through them now. We've got Shining Force, the OG, Shining Force 2, naturally, and Phantasy Star 4. Okay? This, to me, was enough of a reason to own a Sega Genesis. These 3 games more than made up for the lack of quantity as far as JRPGs go on the Genesis. Shining Force is possibly the game I've played the most in my life. I don't know if I can't back that up with actual data, but it's gonna be pretty high on the list if you're talking just sheer playtime, because my brother and I played and replayed Shining Force. It made strategy role-playing accessible. I've said for a long time on this channel that I never really got into strategy RPGs. I'm trying to now. I'm playing more strategy RPGs like Disgaea and Tactics Ogre and things like that. And I'm not as intimidated by them as I used to be, but I was big time intimidated by them in my younger days. And games like Shining Force and Shining Force 2, well, not games like them, just these 2, Shining Force and Shining Force 2, made the genre accessible to me. And I always remember thinking, playing later strategy games, why can't this just be more like Shining Force? You know, it's Shining Force 1 maybe didn't have the most compelling story, but it was a colorful adventure. You get a ton of different characters. The battle animations, like, it just did some really cool things with graphical presentation. And again, just sort of elevated the bar, right? It just raised the bar for everybody else to say, like, your battles might look fine, but like, look what we're doing over here. We're really raising the quality on what's being put out. Shining Force 2 had all that, a bigger cast of characters, and a story that I think rivals a lot of the Super Nintendo classic JRPG stories. So Shining Force 2 is everything Shining Force 1 was, plus even more. And that big of a leap is the only thing comparable in the era would be the Final Fantasy IV to Final Fantasy VI leap. And technically speaking, they had Final Fantasy V in between there, so it was more of a gradual step towards 6. I don't know how they did this, going from Shining Force to Shining Force 2. Just like, they did it. They figured it out. Phantasy Star 4, I probably don't even need to say a ton about Phantasy Star 4 because I think it's pretty widely beloved. But again, it's this very important evolution for JRPG storytelling, showing us that, you know, going forward, having 2 little 16-bit sprites on the screen with a text box driving your story forward isn't going to cut it anymore, right? Phantasy Star's coming in here with their full, like, color comic book manga style cutscenes and lots of drama and, you know, a combat system that's fast and a lot of fun, frustrating at times, but it was an old school JRPG. Of course, it's going to be frustrating at times. So it's just like such a big step up from the previous games. Phantasy Star 2 I had a lot of fun with as a kid. I never got very far. Phantasy Star 3 I never played, but I've heard not great things about it, so I'm not going to try to finagle a place for it on this list. It maybe doesn't deserve it, but 4 I think definitely does. 4 is a quintessential sci-fi role-playing game that you should check out. Okay, I think that's it for the Renaissance. Like I said, I ended up, no, it's not. I would have kicked myself if I forgot Chrono Trigger. Duh, it was sitting right there. I almost forgot it. It's because I called that audible. I threw myself off. I had a rhythm and I broke it. I broke out of the rhythm. Chrono Trigger is, how do I talk about Chrono Trigger realistically? I've said before it's my favorite game of all time, so it's hard for me to be objective, but I'm gonna try. Chrono Trigger doesn't do much that is new, yeah? Like, it uses the active time battle system from Final Fantasy, so it's not even really inventing its own battle system at the basic level. Yeah, from a gameplay perspective, you know, it introduces combination moves and stuff. Pretty cool, like, you know, cool addition to the combat, but it's not doing anything that's changing the world, really. There's maybe a couple things, and I'll talk about those too, but it's, what it really is it is a fully refined 16-bit JRPG, right? It's taken all of the learning that the teams have done over the course of making every 8-bit and 16-bit JRPG that they'd worked on. And it brings in, you know, the folks from the Dragon Quest team and the Final Fantasy team together, pooling their knowledge, pooling all that experience, and giving us basically the quintessential perfect, it's not, but you know what I mean, like the culmination of all that, of everything that had come before it, and just crystallizing into, to me, what kind of feels like a perfect experience. Despite nothing being perfect, it just kind of, I come away from it feeling like I had the perfect experience of this game. Wow, they did it. Now, it did do some things that were actually revolutionary in the broader JRPG landscape. The most notable, I think, is New Game Plus. I don't recall ever seeing New Game Plus as a thing prior to Chrono Trigger. Now it's in just about every game. Not even JRPG, like every game has a New Game Plus mode now. And I'm pretty sure we owe that in large part to Chrono Trigger. If I'm wrong and there's some game that did it before and Chrono Trigger was just ripping that off, let me know in the comments, educate me. But I think that it's Chrono Trigger. I think Chrono Trigger started that. That's a pretty big deal. That is a pretty big deal. It also kind of showed us that, you know, people are going to be fine with smaller parties. Prior to this, most games had 4 or 5 character parties. Chrono Trigger whittled it down to 3, and that worked just fine and was a lot of fun. And a lot of JRPGs since then have kind of had 3 as the default party size. It varies between 3 and 4, but you don't often see 5 character parties anymore. But yeah, it showed that smaller party sizes can work, but really the biggest thing that it did was New Game Plus. And it deserves a lot of credit for that, I think. Again, if I'm wrong, let me know. But for now, I'm gonna go with that. Okay, next up is the Restoration period. This is, as you might have guessed if you're following along, the PlayStation 1 era. I guess you could throw Sega Saturn in there, but I'm gonna spoil it a little bit. I don't have any Sega Saturn games on here. There also are not any N64 games on here. And I'll leave it to you to figure out why that might be. Okay, I've got some big, important games here that I want to introduce to the canon. To get the obvious out of the way right up front, I think Final Fantasy VII absolutely deserves a place in the canon for doing maybe the most for the genre in terms of bringing in new people. You know, as great as Final Fantasy VI is, as great as even Chrono Trigger is, and Earthbound, and all of these games that came before it, their success was limited by the number of fans that existed for the genre. You know, people liked their 2D platformers. They liked, I'm sure even at the time, playing Madden, or if Madden wasn't a thing, you know, the football game on the Super Nintendo, I don't know. So it wasn't, you know, it wasn't a huge genre. It wasn't as big of a deal as it is today. And even today, it's, you know, relatively small compared to like Call of Duty or whatever, but compared to back in the 16-bit, 8-bit, and 16-bit eras, like it's just, the fan base is massive. And we owe a huge chunk of that fan base to Final Fantasy VII. The marketing they did for that game, just the fact that it was such a fantastic video game experience from start to finish, the way it showed that like fans will accept this sort of change in the style of game. Like, you know, everybody associated role-playing games with swords and sorcery, and it was medieval castles and knights and kings and dragons and, you know. And Final Fantasy VII kind of has most of that stuff, but it sets it in this sort of sci-fi, cyberpunk-y kind of world. Maybe cyberpunk's not right, but you know what I mean, like kind of a combination of settings. And it pulls it all off so well and just creates this unique world that most games just wouldn't have even tried making, right? So yeah, I mean, and to say nothing of like what Final Fantasy VII has become in the 20 years since it came out, right? Like 25 years? It's been a long time. It has grown, and the series, as the Final Fantasy VII series, has become such a big thing for not just Square Enix, but for me personally. Like, I love it. I'm such a big fan of the world and the characters. To me, it's the Final Fantasy world that feels the most fully realized, the most unique and interesting world, maybe in any JRPG, in my opinion. So yeah, I mean, 7 gets on the list for me. It just gets on the list. Next up, I want to talk about Final Fantasy Tactics. Final Fantasy Tactics is another one that I will fully admit I was not the biggest fan of when I was a teenager. I had just come off of Final Fantasy VII. Here's another Final Fantasy game so soon. Like, what did we do to deserve this bounty from the Lord above, right? Like, we're just getting all these Final Fantasies and RPGs, and I'm so excited. I was not prepared for Final Fantasy Tactics. It was such a challenging game. It was so difficult. And maybe that's just me being an impatient teenager. I'm going to say that it definitely was me just being an impatient teenager, not taking the time to learn how to play the game properly. And so suffering the consequences of not knowing how to play and doing poorly and getting frustrated and giving up. So it's on this list because I acknowledge how important it is to the genre. The reason so many people just won't shut up about Final Fantasy Tactics and wanting a remake or a remaster, bring it to modern platforms, you know, maybe that's happening, allegedly it is because of how big and how important this game was for the tactical subgenre of JRPGs. And I'm looking forward to this remake or remaster or whatever it ends up being so that I can finally get it, so that I can finally have a chance to come at this as an adult and experience it the way I should have or could have if I had been a little more patient as a kid. So Final Fantasy Tactics is going to be on the list because this is one of those instances where I've heard enough voices that I respect saying this is a classic, this is beautiful, this is what strategy RPGs need to be. I can take their word for it, and I'm going to put it on my list in the hopes that I will get to experience the fulfillment of having fully experienced this game one day soon. This might be a weird one. I have not talked about this series yet, and it has appeared, well, it started on the Super Nintendo and continued on into the PlayStation era. And I haven't talked about either of the games that came before this, but we're gonna start with Tales of Destiny 2, otherwise known in the rest of the world as Tales of Eternia. Called it Destiny 2 over here because, I don't know, I guess they wanted it to be, I don't know, they thought it would sell better as a sequel to Tales of Destiny, which I thought was kind of a mediocre game. So I don't know. You tell me. There's an actual Tales of Destiny 2 in Japan as well, which is a direct sequel to Tales of Destiny. So it just further complicates things. I usually refer to this one as Tales of Eternia because that's what it is. Anyway, Tales of Eternia was the point for me where I realized I was going to get into the Tales of series. I played Fantasia, Tales of Fantasia on the Super Nintendo, emulated that on my Super NT, my analog Super NT, and it was fine. It was like a cool experience. I think I probably would have enjoyed it a bit more if I'd played it as a kid. I remember seeing like pictures in magazines for it and being like, oh my gosh, this looks so cool. I can't wait till this comes out. Womp womp. Never came out. And then Tales of Destiny on the PlayStation I played, and I kind of found it boring, if I'm 100% honest. It did not grab me. And so I was starting to worry that like maybe this wasn't for me. I was like, it's okay, but I'm not feeling it. Tales of Destiny 2, the presentation of this game and its story is a big deal, and I'll tell you why. It is such a big step up from the tile sort of pixel art style that these games had been before, and that, you know, frankly, a majority of JRPGs had been before. These like hand-painted, visuals, gorgeous, just gorgeous backgrounds in this game. The fact that there is so much voice acting in this game was huge. I had no idea because I didn't play this again till I was an adult, but if I had played this as a teenager, I think it would have just blown my mind how much these characters talk. And, you know, it's hokey or whatever. Like, I feel like voice acting in video games was more on the hokey side until the late 2000s, mid 2010s maybe, started to be taken a little more seriously and given a little more budget to do a better job with it. So yeah, it leans on the hokey side, but that's fine. Not everything has to. It's okay. Embrace the cringe is what I want to say. Just like, it's okay for things to be cringe sometimes. Like, it's fine. Like, just live in your feelings, experience your feelings a little bit. It's okay. Like, enjoy it. I don't know. I find it fun sometimes. Some cringe stuff, I'm like, yeah, I like that. That's cool. Anyway, the presentation of the story, just the amount of voice acting, the graphical presentation, just exceptional. I loved Tales of Destiny 2, and I was like, yep, this series is going to find itself a home on my shelves probably forever, and to this point it has. I love the Tales of series, and this is the one that if you're on the fence and you're curious about some of the older entries, this is the one I really recommend. Tales of Eternia or Destiny 2 is the place to go. It's the place to start. It's really, really good. Okay, I'm going to include Chrono Cross in my canon, part of the restoration period here. Chrono Cross is a divisive game, and I have said before on this channel that it disappointed me, and that's true. I haven't changed my feelings on Chrono Cross. It disappointed me significantly. However, I also fully acknowledge how remarkable this game actually is. So many things came together to make what is probably the pinnacle of presentation of this sort of AAA JRPG on the PlayStation. The graphics, I mean, looking at them today, it's like, well, was that good? But looking at this on a CRT TV back in the, I guess, technically it came out in 2000, whatever, late 90s, early 2000s, seeing it on a CRT TV, it was stunningly beautiful. Whether or not you consider the huge cast of like 40 playable characters a detriment or a benefit, the fact that it has a cast of 40 playable characters with unique moves and, you know, dialogue is crazy. It's bonkers. Like, how did they localize this game? Like, how did they write it in the first place? And then how did they localize it? And if everything else about if I hated this game, if I hated everything else about this game, and I don't. But if I did, I might still include it in the canon because of Yasunori Mitsuda's brilliant score. It's an achievement. I don't know what else to say about it. He's a genius. It's an achievement. All right, the last game that I want to talk about for this era is Xenogears. This actually, and I think this Chrono Cross is as well, my original copy from when I was, I don't know, 16 when this came out. Ugh, disc is loose. Yeah, this is my original copy here. Xenogears changed my life? That sounds dramatic. It is dramatic, but it did change my life. And in some pretty significant ways. Its story was so compelling, so long and twisting and deep and complicated that it kind of helped me understand myself as a writer and understand what I like. It like sort of defined for me the sort of fiction that I like. I wouldn't have been able to put my finger on it before, but now I could point at Xenogears and say, I like stories like that. Stories like Xenogears are very appealing to me. It also did a lot in terms of like teaching me to question authority. When authority doesn't seem like it's really got my best interests in mind. I'm trying to speak delicately about this I don't want to upset anyone. Yeah, to question authority when authority doesn't have our best interests at heart. I was always taught that you didn't do that no matter what. Regardless of how you felt or whatever, you did not question authority. This game, I guess, sort of showed me that not only can you do that, sometimes you should, and it has had ramifications that I would say are very positive in my life, rippling out ever since. So in the 24 years or whatever since I played this game, it has continued to have a positive effect on me. So yeah, canonize it right now. Oh, I also wanted to give, I guess, an honorable mention. Well, not an honorable mention. I want to include Symphony of the Night, Castlevania Symphony of the Night. I talked about Castlevania 2 before, and like the Metroidvania, and how the Castlevania side is more of the JRPG side of the subgenre, and Symphony of the Night is like the pinnacle of that. And I feel like as indie developers in particular have sort of chased the Metroidvania style as like what they want their games to be. There's so many Metroidvanias now. The ones that are focusing on the JRPG side of things are really just trying to recapture that Symphony of the Night magic. And some of them have come pretty close or have succeeded, I would even say. There's a lot that fell short of the mark, even from Konami themselves. I don't think they've ever hit the heights of Symphony of the Night themselves since, but it's a very, very important work in that subgenre. So I want to make sure that I include that as well. Okay, I'm realizing this is getting long. I don't know what we're at. If we're at 50 minutes or something ridiculous, maybe not quite, especially once I edit this down a little bit, but it's getting long. I did not expect that I would be talking for close to what's looking like going to be 90 minutes. So we're going to end the video here. We're going to stop. We're about halfway through. We're halfway through. So we're going to do a part 2. We're going to do a part 2, and we're going to get back into this and handle the more recent console generations. But for now, I hope that this is fun. I hope that you're not too ticked off by my selections or omissions. Like I said, if you have any in these console generations that I didn't include and you think I should have, please let me know down in the comments. Give me a brief argument for why you think it should be in the canon, and I will happily consider it. Like I said, maybe I haven't played it, or maybe I did and just forgot because I've got the dumb brains. It's entirely possible I played it and just forgot it, and maybe I loved it and still forgot it, and that happens. Aging, right? You know, what are you gonna do? Anyway, I do hope that you enjoyed this. I hope that you'll stick around. Thank you for liking the video. If you did like it, please like it on YouTube. That's so important just for the algorithm. I really appreciate it. And again, if you aren't subscribed and you like the vibe here, I would really love it if you subscribed. It would mean so much to me. Anyway, until next time. Bye.